Madam Deputy President, I rise to make my contribution to the Governor's address and reply. I congratulate Her Excellency Barbara Baker on commencing her term as Governor of Tasmania. I'm particularly pleased for only the second time in the history of this state to see a woman appointed to this role. I also take this opportunity to very warmly extend my thanks to our outgoing Governor, Professor Kate Warner, who fulfilled her duties with thoughtfulness, inclusiveness, warmth and grace. As the first female Governor of this state, Professor Warner was an inspiration to the whole community in her exemplary approach to this role. As this is the first time that I've risen to speak in this new term of government, I wish to acknowledge the Palawa Pakana of Lutruwita, Tasmania, the traditional owners and ongoing custodians of this land. Thank you. I acknowledge the Muwinina people, originally of this place, Nipaluna Hobart, and mourn that none of the Muwinina people survived European invasion to be with us today. I pay my respects to the elders of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community, past, present and emerging. I acknowledge the continued connection of the Palawa Pakana to this land for over 40,000 years and the rich and enduring culture that lives in that connection. I acknowledge that after invasion by Europeans, this land was never ceded by the Tasmanian Aboriginal people. It always was and always will be Aboriginal land. Madam Deputy President, I congratulate the members who are new to this chamber, the new member for Windermere, and I wish him very well in this place. I particularly congratulate returning members to this chamber also, the member for Mersey, who came through quite readily without a contest, and of course our President, the member for Derwent, who contested his election and was successful. I also congratulate the government on its election victory in the state election held in May, and those who've been elected to the other place for the first time, Janie Finlay MP, Dean Winter MP and Christy Johnson MP, and in particular Christy Johnson MP as the first independent member elected to the other place in its current configuration. I add my acknowledgement to those members who lost their seats in the recent election and my thanks to them for the service that they gave in their time in Parliament. In particular, I want to note the very worthy contribution, the laudable work ethic and the personal integrity of Alison Standen, who I've known for many years due to close work connections prior to both of us being elected to Parliament. Madam Deputy President, here we are at the beginning of a new term of government, approximately a year earlier than expected, and most of us here share a sense, I think, of urgency to make up for the 3 lost months of parliamentary business since the Assembly was dissolved in late March. Here we are near the end of June, and in this place we are only in our second sitting week of this calendar year. Further, we'll now find ourselves sitting for a mere 2 weeks and having a further break for winter recess, pushing back even further the ability of Parliament to fully undertake its important role in our democracy. Given that we are still emerging from a pandemic, health and economic crisis, this, I think, is an unacceptable situation. This state has been deprived of appropriate parliamentary scrutiny of the government for many months, and that is quite simply anti-democratic, in my view. My concern is that this orchestration of a protracted period with an absence of parliamentary oversight demonstrates a disdainful attitude to Parliament, which risks becoming too familiar from this government. In reflecting on the Governor's address at the outset, I wish to warmly welcome the announcement that Tasmania will at long last investigate a truth-telling pathway to treaty process with our fellow Aboriginal citizens. I felt cautious initially in welcoming this long-awaited commitment due to the scarcity of information originally provided in the speech and the Premier's media release that went out also on the same day. Specifically, I was hoping to be reassured that the Tasmanian Aboriginal community had been appropriately consulted with in formulating the key elements of this announcement, including the appointees charged with undertaking the facilitation process, which will culminate in an initial report in October to the government. Subsequent to Tuesday's announcement, I note that there have been a range of voices from the Tasmanian Aboriginal community embracing and welcoming this initiative, and I'm particularly reassured by that to see the endorsement of this way forward. Progressing treaty with the Tasmanian Aboriginal people has been a very long time coming in this state. Victoria was in fact the first state to pass a legal framework for treaty negotiations in 2018. In 2020, Victoria also became the first Australian jurisdiction to commit to the creation of a Truth and Justice Commission. South Australia had begun its treaty process earlier, even in 2016, when the Labor state government there at the time established the South Australian Treaty Commissioner and allocated over $4 million over 5 years to progress treaty negotiations with Indigenous groups. This process looked at establishing about 40 treaties across South Australia. However, it did become paused with the election of the Liberal state government there in 2018. Queensland, I note, also established in 2019 its treaty working group and eminent treaty process panel, with the Premier accepting in August last year recommendations to progress the path to treaty with First Nations Queenslanders. In 2019, the Northern Territory Government appointed Mick Dodson as Treaty Commissioner to undertake consultation in progressing treaty there. So here we are finally for our state. What a welcome move forward. I'm reassured that key representatives of the Tasmanian Aboriginal community are endorsing and welcoming this long-awaited proposal for Tasmania to have a pathway to treaty process, which has been outlined in the Governor's address, and I welcome our state's move. Eventually, we've finally got there to do it. Other than this one exciting announcement, Madam Deputy President, I must confess my surprise at the lack of strategic government agenda provided during Tuesday's speech. While it's to be expected that there would be a certain amount of recycled election commitments and previous commitments, I was waiting for a more detailed plan, not only the pre-announced action points, but also something more substantial and transformative for our state. Given the extent of Tuesday's speech, relying upon government self-congratulatory backslapping and recycled election announcements, many which were in turn derived from that PESRAC process, which was outlined in March in the Premier's address, it again makes me wonder, why did we have to go to an early election? If the government had just got on with delivering those announcements, instead of interrupting the potentially productive last 3 months with an early election, it's quite possible many of those initiatives could have been implemented or at least substantially progressed by now. Despite the government's rhetoric, we're not presented in the speech and in the government's plan with a coherent, comprehensive plan spanning the term of this re-elected government. Instead, we largely have a lacklustre list of piecemeal action dot points. Again, I put the commitment to a path to treaty process separate to that and acknowledge that it is new and very warmly welcome. Elsewhere, other jurisdictions are crafting and reiterating the need for long-term strategic and transformational reforms intended to address structural inequalities exposed even further by the COVID pandemic, as well as ensuring lessons from the pandemic are learned and opportunities seized as much as challenges are met. We did not receive that in this jurisdiction in Tuesday's speech or the government's presented plan. Madam Deputy President, in my contribution today, I want to focus on a theme, the theme of public confidence, specifically the fundamental need for the Tasmanian public to be provided with confidence in a healthy and respected democracy, in the highest standards of good governance, in a transparent and accountable government with the vision and leadership to drive transformational change to tackle the biggest challenges faced by our state. I believe this is an unmet need under this current government, and I would like to see that improve across the term of this government. With that lens of public confidence, I'll reflect on the recent election, on some elements of the government's agenda, both inclusions and omissions from that, and I want to extend an invitation to the government, for this historic third-term Liberal government, to move beyond a day-to-day, week-to-week grasping at and shoring up of its own power, to a mature, visionary, accountable leadership for this state. Accumulated political capital should afford the perfect conditions for this. It may be that the government does not have as much political capital as it thought it had before the election, given that beyond the Premier's impressive personal vote, cribbed largely, I might add, from his own Bass colleagues, the result of the election was rather less than resounding, to be honest, when we look at the figures. I challenge you to look at the figures if you haven't already done so. But it's still likely that this government's current stockpile of political capital is close to what we may imagine will be at its zenith attained through competent management of the COVID-19 emergency. Now is the time for the government to put aside empty rhetoric, the tick box lists of busy work and the promises that lack accountable delivery. Now is the time for this government to rise above the unfortunately low bar of simply being better than the alternative. Now is the time for this government to earn the privilege it has been given by the Tasmanian people with a third term, to lead this state in transformational change, to make meaningful progress on the entrenched challenges that we face. Madam Deputy President, reflecting on the most important aspect of public confidence, the first matter I'd like to turn to is the recent election. This week I've tabled a motion to establish a joint select committee to inquire into the 2021 state election and 2021 Legislative Council elections and matters related thereto. Elections are a fundamental right of the citizens of Tasmania. It is vital that public confidence in the conduct of elections is maintained. Parliament can, and indeed must, play a key role in maintaining that confidence. In other jurisdictions, this is undertaken through the routine practice of conducting a parliamentary review or inquiry after each election. For example, the Federal Parliament has a joint standing committee on electoral matters which undertakes a routine inquiry after each federal election. Members from all parties, including the government, participate freely and openly in that inquiry and as members of that committee. The inquiry that I propose will deliver a general review of the administration of the 2021 elections, as distinct, I would point out, from the outcome of those elections, which are not part of the inquiry. It's in the public interests as an important opportunity to deliver increased public confidence and to strengthen our democracy, and it should be a routine priority for this Parliament to give this sort of matter due consideration as a matter of course. We know that a range of serious and significant concerns have been raised by both political and community stakeholders about the recently held state and legislative council elections. These concerns have included, but are not limited to, the legitimacy of the rationale for calling an early election, concerns over breaches of the caretaker conventions, issues with the pre-selection and subsequent resignation of Adam Brooks in the seat of Braddon, concerns over potential voter disenfranchisement due to the apparent failure to provide Legislative Council ballot papers at all voting booths, and significantly for this chamber, numerous concerns with the appropriateness and the impact of holding concurrent elections with the state and Legislative Council elections run on the same day. The only appropriate and accountable mechanism to examine the many and varied concerns raised is a parliamentary inquiry with a broad and open terms of reference, which is what I've proposed. I believe it's particularly important for our Parliament to show leadership and accountability on this, given the fact we have now experienced 2 state elections in a row that have given rise to community questions, concerns and prompted a diminishment of confidence in our democracy amongst Tasmanian citizens. It's very much appropriate for the 50th Parliament to examine the nature and circumstances of its formation and to provide the Tasmanian people with confidence in the electoral process. I hope to have the support of colleagues in this place to progress the establishment of the Joint House Select Committee for this purpose, and I look forward to speaking in more detail on this when we debate the motion. Madam Deputy President, I'll move on to elements of the government agenda and some omissions which concern me. It's extraordinary that a government which both attributes its re-election in no insignificant manner to their handling of the COVID-19 pandemic has failed to prioritise providing a comprehensive, ongoing pandemic and COVID response plan. A crucial aspect of a response and recovery plan must be an evaluation process. As members may recall, on the 3rd of June last year, a year ago, in fact this month, this chamber voted in support of a motion I moved to establish a Joint House Select Committee on Tasmania's COVID-19 response and recovery measures. Unfortunately, the establishment of that committee was rejected narrowly in the other place. However, the purpose and intent behind the call for such a committee still stands, that it provide a mechanism to provide that it would provide a mechanism to give continued oversight over pandemic responses, provide a forum where the community could raise their pandemic experiences and impacts, as well as share potential positives and initiatives, and importantly, to serve as a comprehensive repository of factual information detailing what didn't work, lessons learned, and by doing so, provide a resource to help inform future crises of this scale. It's worth noting that during the debate on whether to establish that proposed committee last year, the point was made by some that it may be too soon for such an oversight and lessons learned forum, and that it may make sense to wait until later. Well, it's now 12 months later, and while we do experience periodic déjà vu with outbreaks and lockdowns occurring interstate, we also have a government claiming there are more Tasmanians employed now than ever before, and just yesterday the Minister for Trade enthusiastically welcoming the state's largest ever international merchandise for a 12-month period. The state of emergency declaration was allowed to quietly expire in November last year, and while we still have in place the public health emergency declaration scheduled to expire on the 30th of July this year, Tasmanians enjoy more social movement freedoms and less COVID-related direct disruptions in their daily lives than many of our interstate counterparts. Of course, I stress this situation is a result of much hard work and sacrifice across all our community, and we don't want to risk undermining that and our hard-won achievements by allowing ourselves to become complacent. But here we are now, 12 months on, from when the government said that there may be a place for my proposed committee at a later date. And are we at the time to be establishing a formal COVID-19 pandemic impacts and response review process to ensure that we capture all lessons to be learned and all relevant experiences, challenges and opportunities Tasmanians from every walk of life have grappled with over the past 12 months? Let me just pause here to state that on some small level it appears the government does agree for the need for a review to review and evaluate processes. An election campaign commitment, which is also included in the government's first 100 days list of priorities, is a review of the State's Emergency Management Act 2006. This is very interesting. It begs the question why? Why this Act and why review one Act in isolation? The Emergency Management Act 2006 comprises one element of the Tasmanian Emergency Management Arrangements, TEMA. The TEMA comprises a range of emergency management committees, advisory groups, strategies, guidelines and frameworks. There's also the Office of Security and Emergency Management, housed within DPAC. Time prevents me from discussing all these different elements here and now, but suffice to repeat, given our experience of a 15-month and counting pandemic, why only review one Act? There's also, out of the range of measures and processes and arrangements we've got in place, that all comprehensively would be timely to review. There's also a range of discrete, specific reviews and inquiries occurring on elements of the COVID-19 experience, some by the Auditor-General, some by PAC here in Parliament, the Public Accounts Committee. All of these inquiries will be valuable, but they are to some extent ad hoc and unconnected. We do not have in place, or appear to have in place, an evaluation and review mechanism that would provide a cohesive repository to draw together these separate efforts and to identify and then fill in gaps in a comprehensive way. We need a comprehensive and formal evaluation process. We need to rigorously examine what worked and what could be improved, and we need to do that in a way that's led by the government to ensure that we are well prepared for any future eventualities or challenges that we incur in a similar way to the situation we've had with COVID. Similarly, such a process could scrutinise and evaluate the role and the functions and the operations, indeed the interrelationships between our government structures and National Cabinet, between the state government, state parliament, local government, and the implications for the Tasmanian community during this very unique period of our history. How are we capturing all these complex things that have played out, these complex interrelationships, to ensure that we learn from them for the future? Holding a formal review and evaluation process is part of a responsible preparation for future events. And, Madam Deputy President, I wish to again place on the record and reiterate my long-held position that Tasmania needs to undertake this pandemic response evaluation in some manner. It should be an intrinsic component of any state government providing a comprehensive plan for moving forward. Madam Deputy President, I'll now turn to the important issue of gender equality. I acknowledge there are others here who also share concerns and focus about needing to progress gender equity issues. I particularly thank you, Madam Deputy President, as the member for Murchison. In your recent contribution, you spoke about this in detail, and I think our comments will align well. I also acknowledge and thank you for putting forward a motion to establish a select committee on gender equity, which I think is an excellent sessional committee on gender equity, which I think is an excellent proposal for this parliament and one that I feel very much in support of. Clearly, this is not a new issue or challenge. However, globally, the COVID-19 pandemic has shone a spotlight upon the entrenched gender fault lines impacting too many women and girls. And Tasmania is not immune to this very serious situation. In May this year, UN Women released a report entitled "The Social Protection Response to COVID-19 Has Failed Women Towards Universal Gender Responsive Social Protection Systems." This report notes that while the COVID-19 pandemic started as a major public health challenge, it, and I quote, quickly morphed into a protracted socio-economic crisis with which countries are still grappling. This crisis has been a great revealer, laying bare pre-existing structural inequalities of class, gender, race and migration status, while exposing yawning gaps in social protection systems. While presenting a global focus, this report does identify that globally the crisis has had a disproportionate impact upon women generally. For example, women predominate in temporary, part-time, self-employment and or formal economies, all of which were hit hard by lockdowns and related economic constraints. Further, a higher proportion of female workers compared to male workers are reliant upon sectors that were hardest hit by the pandemic, such as hospitality, food and beverage industries, wholesale and retail trade, and arts and entertainment, just to mention a few. Women are also overrepresented in the essential frontline services in healthcare and other social services that are most at risk in pandemic circumstances. Research and economies have established without a doubt that crises such as this pandemic are not gender neutral. COVID-19 impact research reveals that women internationally and here at home are affected disproportionately and differently from men, affecting access to employment and livelihoods, to education, health services and safety from violence. At the national level, the AMA released in March this year a statement on the impact of COVID-19 on women, which corroborates the global research of the UN reports. This statement from the AMA includes this. Research suggests during times of crisis such as the COVID-19 pandemic, the challenges and burdens faced by women are exacerbated, with women's economic security, participation in formal employment, political representation, health outcomes and educational achievement negatively impacted, and more so than men. And further, it notes that within the healthcare sector, nearly 4 in 5 healthcare workers in the front line tasked with managing the pandemic were women, increasing their exposure and potentially their family members to the virus. As pandemic-related work responsibilities increased, women were more likely to manage increased childcare and schooling obligations, coupled with disproportionate household responsibilities, even among dual-earning couples. Madam Deputy President, in light of the pandemic experience last year, with even more urgency, I called for the 2020-2021 state budget to include a gender impact statement, with other jurisdictions such as Victoria, for example, including it as a matter of course. While it did not eventuate that time around with the budget presented in November, the then Minister for Women, the Honourable Sarah Courtenay, did undertake, during budget estimates in November, to examine the feasibility of implementing a Tasmanian gender impact budget statement. While it was heartening to see the last federal budget restore the national gender impact statement, previously abandoned under Tony Abbott's Prime Ministership, that does not relieve this state from implementing a similar responsibility and accountability measure. Hence, I reiterate that call now, Madam Deputy President, and hopefully we will see a Tasmanian gender impact budget statement to be included in the forthcoming state budget on the 22nd of August, or 26th of August? 24th of August. In August, when we have the state budget delivered.
No, it is.
Further, I reiterate my call to go further than that, to actually take the same concept and extend it to Cabinet consideration. I call for the template for Cabinet papers to also include, as part of its standard planning and approvals checklist, a gender implications component. As it's my understanding, it does have already an economic and financial implications analysis provided. And again, this is a well-established practice in some other jurisdictions, such as New Zealand. These are both a gender impact analysis of the budget and a gender impact component to a Cabinet consideration. These are only small initial steps, but what they seek to do is ensure that gender equity implications and ramifications of the government's decision-making processes upon the immediate and long-term well-being of Tasmanian women and girls is identified. It's acknowledged and hopefully addressed in a more meaningful and effective manner. I had been hopeful that the Governor's address would provide an update regarding the progress of the inquiry into the parliamentary workplace culture that was agreed to in March by the presiding officers, all three party leaders and the Assembly Independent at that time, just prior to the election being called. It's interesting to note that the South Australian Parliament has just established a joint committee to inquire into and report on recommendations which arose from the South Australian Equal Opportunity Commissioner's report into harassment in that parliamentary workplace. That committee has also been charged with drafting an MP's Code of Conduct for consideration of both houses of the South Australian Parliament. So they've not only done their harassment assessment of their parliamentary workplace, they now have a committee working on progressing that. We also know that the federal parliamentary inquiry of a similar manner is progressing, and it would be a shame to see Tasmania abandon this worthwhile endeavour and risk falling behind as a responsible parliament that ensures its workplaces are safe. Madam Deputy President, something not mentioned directly in the Governor's address but present in the government's commitments for its first 100 days is the long-awaited and overdue political donations reform. This is a crucial matter when we contemplate public confidence in the integrity of our democracy. Back in March, in my reply to the Premier's address, I noted the conspicuous absence of discussion in that address of the government's commitment to political donation reform. Indeed, there was nary a mention. I said in that speech in March, it would be a blatant, untenable and unforgivable breach of public trust should Tasmanians go to the polls again without knowing who has given money to whom. Lo and behold, Madam Deputy President, we soon came to see why the conspicuous silence was maintained. The government were indeed about to call a very early election that self-same week in advance of making any public progress on meaningful political donation reform. And now we find ourselves post-election with a promise that the reform we have been waiting for since it was first committed to in May 2018, that it will be brought to Parliament apparently in the second half of this year. How convenient to have skated through yet another state election with entirely inadequate accountability and transparency around who funded that election. It has to be placed on the public record at this time, clearly and unequivocally, that this exercise in political procrastination is quite bluntly unacceptable, it's shameful and it's insulting to the Tasmanian voters. People are becoming more and more cynical and distrustful of this government as the political donations procrastination drags on. For over 3 years now, since former Premier Will Hodgman's promise following that thoroughly tainted and controversial state election, thanks to the corrosive cloud of vested interests money flowing into certain coffers, campaign coffers at that time. After all this time and all these excuses, Tasmanians have a right to expect a nation-leading, platinum-plated proposed electoral funding and donations disclosure reform bill when it is finally released. It must provide for as close as possible to real-time disclosure of political donations as we can possibly achieve. It must have a transparent disclosure threshold, not the outrageous $5,000 amount nominated by the Premier as part of the ineffectual voluntary disclosure sham with which concerned Tasmanians were fobbed off during the recent state election. Other states employ a $1,000 disclosure threshold, and there would need to be a very good reason indeed presented for Tasmania to adopt any higher disclosure rate than that. Further, Madam Deputy President, if the new disclosure system requires implementation and maintenance funding and resourcing, then it must receive the full required funding and resourcing. This is not a cost, but an investment in restoring the perception of integrity to our system of governance. We know from other transparency mechanisms in this state, such as our RTI system, that no matter how robust on paper, if the necessary adequate funding is not provided to operate the system as designed, it's rendered farcical in its inability to deliver public confidence in transparent and accountable government. For 2 consecutive general elections now, this Liberal government has dragged down Tasmania's proud democracy into disrepute. Time after time, we hear of the lack of trust and respect the community holds for elected representatives of all stripes. Without swift and decisive, transparent action now on political donation reform, this loss of public trust and confidence risks calcifying into a crisis of governance in this state. As elected community representatives, all of us, both in this and the other place, must prioritise a firm focus and pressure on the revitalisation of governance, accountability, integrity and transparency. Comprehensive, nation-leading, platinum-plated political donation reforms will be one step in the right direction. It's with that same intent of revitalising governance, accountability and integrity and delivering public confidence that I have tabled that motion this week to establish a joint select committee of inquiry into the conduct of the 2021 State and Legislative Council elections. We should be making these things a matter of routine so the public can come to have confidence in the way we conduct ourselves with governance in this state. Madam Deputy President, I want to mention another matter from the government's agenda that appears, after causing much consternation in the community, to have gone quite a bit quiet at this time, and that is the proposal to make TasTAFE a government business enterprise. While some actions to progressing planning activities relating to TasTAFE's capital works and online campus and rural and regional sites do appear in the government's first 100 days document, the dramatic plan to transform TasTAFE into a GBE is not present. I spoke about this intended plan in some detail in my reply to the Premier's address in March this year, when the dramatic proposal to change TasTAFE to a GBE was sprung on the community via a recommendation in the final PESRAC report. Along with all other recommendations in the report, this one was immediately accepted by the government, apparently without any meaningful further consultation with key stakeholders such as TasTAFE teachers or students. Perhaps the government had assumed that the recommendation had arisen out of a thorough and wide-ranging consultation in the PESRAC process. Perhaps the government had imagined that the PESRAC consultation provided a thorough examination of the issues and opportunities relating to TAFE, a rigorous examination of expert evidence and advice, and due consideration of a range of potential options and solutions. If that's what the government imagined, Madam Deputy President, when promptly they accepted that PESRAC recommendation to make TasTAFE a GBE, it was sorely mistaken. As has been confirmed, the issue of TasTAFE did come up in the PESRAC consultations. There was broad agreement that we need to support the upskilling, reskilling and initial training of Tasmanians across all sectors and demographics. However, no robust examination of what problems actually needs to be solved or what new ways of working actually need to be adopted and to achieve this was undertaken in that PESRAC context. Therefore, no convincing case was actually prosecuted that corporatising this entity into a government business enterprise is the appropriate course of action. Put simply, I remain unconvinced of the nature or extent of the perceived TasTAFE problem. Nor am I convinced the GBE proposal is the best way forward. Concerningly, on closer examination, it also came to light that the only submission to PESRAC that promoted this particular recommendation was made by the NCK Evers Network, of which the PESRAC chair, Don Challen, has been a key member. I remain concerned that this proposal has the clear hallmarks of a pre-COVID ideological agenda being implemented by stealth under the cover of COVID. And I hold particular concerns as to the appearance of special consideration being given to a proposal put forward by groups with personal connections to the chair of PESRAC. I highlight that concern, Madam Deputy President, because I know that there were many, many worthy community groups and community stakeholders who made submissions and valuable recommendations to PESRAC, who likely lacked a personal connection to leverage for special consideration. We know that in a state as small as ours, when it comes to having your voice heard and influencing decisions, it is all too easy for it to be more about who you know than the merit of what you know. This is a dynamic that consolidates power and influence amongst a select few and leads to tainted governance. It actively erodes public confidence and trust, and it must be fiercely guarded against. It is the duty of those in power, in decision-making roles, to take particular care to reject and avoid circumstances in which they may perpetuate this kind of exclusive and entitled approach to governance in this state, or even the perception of it. Given the doubtful provenance of the recommendation to make TAFE a GBE and the disruptive uncertainty, particularly for staff and students who are the stakeholders at the centre of this proposal, it's imperative that the government provide clear and timely information on the progress of this proposal and indeed whether it still exists as a proposal. Madam Deputy President, it will come as no surprise to those in this chamber that when it comes to discussing elusive matters in the government's agenda, one topic that I won't let pass without comment is that of poker machine reform. I say elusive because it appears that this is the policy that must not be named, or at least the policy that must be kept out of sight so as to be out of mind to the greatest extent possible. Why would this be, Madam Deputy President? Why would it be that this policy, the policy most visible at the 2018 election, indeed the policy that funded the 2018 election for the government, subsequently appears to have been hushed up and pushed down to the end of the queue? Originally promised to come to this place in the first half of 2020, COVID-19 appeared to provide a reason for its delay. However, if the bill was on track for the autumn sitting of 2020, the exposure draft should have been very close to be ready at that time that COVID struck and able to be progressed at some point during that year once the early stages of the pandemic had abated. Despite being then promised to be progressed in the first quarter of this year, it didn't rate a mention in the Premier's address in March, not a whisper. In my reply to the Premier's address, I spoke about the government's long-stalled future gaming markets reform. Let me remind you briefly of what I said at that time. Should we be in a position where an early election is called and will be held prior to political donation reform and prior to future gaming markets reform, I call on the government here and now and all other political parties to make public commitments not to accept any pre-election donations from any poker machine industry entities or any entities directly associated and financial beneficiaries of the poker machine industry. I call on the government right now to make that commitment to the Tasmanian people. We deserve to go to the next election with a clear understanding that it is not being funded, bought or influenced by that same industry. Well, Madam Deputy President, that was a prescient call, as an early election was then immediately called by the government. Tasmanians went to the polls in May in the dark, yet again, as to the full extent of the financial influence brought to bear by the poker machine industry on that fundamental pillar of our democracy, our state election. Yet again, there's a simple way to put paid to the stain that this casts on the integrity of our democracy, a very simple way to restore public confidence. And that would be for this government and all parties to fully disclose right now exactly what financial gifts were provided to them by any poker machine industry interests prior to and during the 2021 state election campaign. Make it public. Declare it openly. If They are not ashamed of it, Madam Deputy President. Why wouldn't they declare it to the Tasmanian people as a matter of transparency and integrity? The continuing buying of influence, indeed buying of policy and regulatory outcomes, casts a rank shadow over this government until it has the decency to come clean to the Tasmanian people. We are right to ask questions about that influence. Via the budget estimate process last year, we were told to expect the pokies legislation in the autumn sitting of this year, after exposure draft was to be released and consulted on. During budget estimates on the 24th of November last year, in response to a question on the time frame, the Premier said, "The negotiations are underway with Federal Hotel regarding casino taxes and fees in Keno are still on foot. I expect that we would conclude those, I would hope, before the end of the year. Next year, legislation, once drafted, will go out for public consultation and then we will introduce it in the autumn session." That's interesting, Madam Deputy President. So, was it actually COVID back in March last year that delayed the progress of this reform? Or was it actually the ongoing unresolved negotiations with the largest vested interest in the industry? Did those negotiations conclude as expected by the end of last year? If not, are they still underway? Importantly, most importantly, were those negotiations concluded prior to the election being called? Well, what do we know about that, Madam Deputy President? The Premier was in fact asked on ABC Radio in March, after the election was called, about whether the casino pokies tax rate had been decided and what it would be. The Premier point blank refused to answer that direct question. He didn't say it was yet to be resolved and the negotiations were continuing. He just refused to answer the question. It was put to him that voters deserved to know ahead of the election what taxation rate a major donor to his party was going to pay. He refused to answer. Voters certainly did deserve, Madam Deputy President, to know what special deals had been locked in for Federal Group in regards to its pokies and Keno taxation rates. In refusing to answer this very straightforward question, the Premier deliberately kept voters in the dark on a key piece of information about state revenue, which was related directly to the vested interests of a major donor to his party. Madam Deputy President, why wasn't the Premier keen to seek a mandate from Tasmanian voters on that matter, I wonder? This is a government very fond of claiming mandates for things they've taken to elections. Why didn't, if it was resolved prior to the election, why didn't this government take its casino pokies tax rate and Keno tax rates to the Tasmanian people to have their say? If, in fact, the rate had been decided, the only reason to keep that piece of information secret prior to the poll is if the Premier believed it would be politically and electorally damaging to him and his party for it to be made public. Key information about state revenue relating directly to the vested interests of a major party donor. Surely, given the secrecy, we can only expect that a sweet deal has in fact been made. Madam Deputy President, I wonder what proportion of the taxation discount provided under this reform for Federal Group, money that will go to the profits of a private company instead of Tasmanian hospitals and schools, I wonder what proportion of that gifted taxpayer money is making its way back into Liberal Party coffers through political donations. Well, thanks to the deliberate delays in progressing donation reform by this government, we will never know the answer to that. It is disgusting. After avoiding any voluntary mentions at all of poker machine reform in the context of that election campaign, the government has also failed to mention it in its first 100 days plan. This is the policy that must not be named, indeed. Perhaps the government hopes that if it delays long enough and sneaks out the exposure draft at some point, what's the bet, in fact, that it will be done on a Friday afternoon as quietly as possible? The public might go all hazy on the circumstances around this appallingly bad reform. Madam Deputy President, let me wrap this topic up with a quick reminder on those circumstances. The policy being implemented by the government was literally written by the vested interests of the poker machine industry. They wrote it and tabled it in the dying days of the parliamentary inquiry into future gaming markets in 2017. Time prevented the inquiry fully considering the industry proposal, but the two pieces of expert comment that were obtained on it at the time by the inquiry both raised serious concerns at its appropriateness. First of those, the Tasmanian Gaming Commission said it would be harder to regulate that model and likely cause increased levels of community harm. The second piece of comment and advice came from the expert economic group Synergies, who were assisting the inquiry, and their advice questioned whether that model in fact provided the most advantageous economic outcomes for the state or not. Despite those two pieces of advice, within months, the government had adopted that industry-written policy. This policy, flagged by the Gaming Commission as likely to cause greater harm, is being progressed by this government without any corresponding preventative harm minimisation. Harm minimisation, Madam Deputy President, which would be very straightforward to implement and commit to. We, in fact, can easily make poker machines safer in Tasmania with actually no negative impact on recreational use and no negative impact on jobs directly associated with that industry. We have simple, evidence-based measures available. Most are just simple programming matters which would be effective in making pokies safer and protecting Tasmanian families and communities. There is no reason a responsible government and a responsible parliament, in fact, wouldn't put the interests of its community first and choose to effectively regulate an addictive product known to cause high levels of harm, especially when those protective measures will have no negative impact on the recreational use of that product or on jobs associated with that product. The only impact would be to reduce, in some measure, that proportion of the industry's profits which comes from users who are addicted. Why would a responsible government choose to protect the private profit derived directly from people suffering a harmful, diagnosable addiction above the well-being and health of the people and communities it's supposed to represent? Madam Deputy President, I look forward to exploring that question once we do finally have this policy and legislation progressed. Presumably, at some point, it will emerge from the shadows. Madam Deputy President, I want to touch on another omission from the government's agenda that I believe is important for our state. Many here will be aware of my long-held focus on human rights and specifically the strengthening of human rights for all Tasmanians. There are many elements of my reply speech here, in fact, as well as contributions that others are also making in this place that touch on indirectly and directly human rights issues, tackling housing waiting lists and homelessness, gambling addiction, gender equity, tackling family violence, addressing discrimination in all forms and protection of civil liberties, to name just a few. Currently, the Tasmanian Law Reform Institute is reviewing the case for a Tasmanian Human Rights Act, which is expected to be released sometime in the near future. I'm hopeful that the government will keep an open mind regarding that report's findings. As we plan for and transition out of the pandemic period, we must incorporate into all our planning and transitioning actions a comprehensive human rights recognition and protection for all Tasmanians. Which leads me, Madam Deputy President, to another gaping hole in the government's so-called plan presented to this Parliament: climate change. Asserting that Tasmania has achieved its annual net zero carbon emissions targets, while encouraging, does not mean we can afford to relax. Just as we cannot be complacent regarding COVID, we cannot afford to be complacent about the threat climate change poses to our economy, our environment and our quality of life. Fundamentally, climate change is actually a human rights issue, and Tasmanians need to see their government and parliament recognise it as such. And they need to see them plan for and address the serious and broad human rights implications of climate change. Since the Paris Agreement became the first international treaty to explicitly recognise the link between climate action and human rights, International governments are developing holistic policy responses, recognising the climate change implications for human rights as well as environmental and economic ones. Further, the European Court of Human Rights has clearly established that various types of environmental degradation can result in violations of substantive human rights, such as the right to life, private and family life, while also increasing the risk of inhumane and degrading treatment. Earlier this week, more than 200 groups wrote to the United Nations Human Rights Council, urging member states to establish a new mandate for a special rapporteur on human rights and climate change. These developments demonstrate that climate change is not just some greenie issue. Governments, courts and other entities recognise that climate change risks the calcifying and deepening of pre-existing and future intergenerational social and economic justice inequities. I'm hopeful that the Premier, holding both the Treasury and climate change portfolios, will be as keen and diligent to address the current climate change crisis and its human rights implications as he has been tackling the pandemic crisis. Madam Deputy President, as we have heard, the Governor's address sets out the government's agenda for its entire term, as well as some of its immediate priorities. In this context, it's worthwhile revisiting the role of the Tasmanian Legislative Council, us here in this place, as outlined on page 3 of the Legislative Council Annual Report 2019-2020, as follows, I quote, "The Legislative Council, as the upper house of the Parliament of Tasmania, can be described as democratic with an independent character. The role of the Council is threefold. 1, to authorise the raising of revenue and the expenditure of state monies. 2, to examine the merits of legislation. And 3, to provide a parliamentary check on the government of the day. In modern times, the role of the Legislative Council has expanded from the base of being a purely legislative body to a house that involves itself in the examination and analysis of actions, decisions and workings of the executive government." Let me just repeat that third point, in case any of us here missed it, or perhaps in case the Premier might be listening at some point to this contribution. 3, to provide a parliamentary check on the government of the day. It's literally in our handbook. Madam Deputy President, this chamber is well within its established remit, as outlined in the annual report, to critique, examine and deliberate upon the government's priorities and actions. This includes the actions not taken in the context of achieving good public policy outcomes on behalf of the electorates that we represent and the broader Tasmanian community. The House of Review does not need to be limited to merely marking off a checklist of government election commitments or other action and busy lists. In this context, on behalf of our constituents, we have the right and, in fact, the responsibility to evaluate any policy shortcomings and identify refinements. It is the responsibility of our chamber and every member here to play a role in delivering the Tasmanian community with confidence in the governance of this state. With that in mind, Madam Deputy President, members here may recall that I and others in this place, including in fact you, Madam Deputy President, have previously called for measurable benchmarking and progress indicators to be developed and incorporated systematically within key government processes such as the state budget. I've previously raised the need for such a genuine and transparent policy progress reporting mechanism to enable meaningful monitoring and evaluation of the implementation of actually the PESTRAC recommendations. I called for that last year. The challenges and opportunities facing Tasmania in this brave new post-pandemic world present us with a once-in-a-century opportunity to redefine all aspects of our social, economic and sustainability circumstances and priorities. We have opportunities to shift the levers pulled by government to address, in a meaningful and long-term manner, intergenerational inequalities. We have discussed some of these opportunities to some extent in the chamber last year and earlier this year. We've stressed in those discussions how the manner of delivery of such reforms can be as important as the reforms themselves in strengthening public confidence if they are transparent, have integrity and demonstrate good governance. The post-COVID focus on redefining and rebuilding Tasmania makes it very timely for the state now, as a matter of urgency, to develop and commit to a rigorous set of public policy priority benchmarks and progress performance indicators. Such a benchmarking and progress indicator system, prioritising transparent monitoring and reporting mechanisms, would encourage community confidence in the rationale for and the delivery of identified policy priorities and outcomes. Importantly, a systematic performance monitoring and reporting approach should break our current reliance on short-term action or spending lists in isolation from any accountability mechanism evaluating actual progress in addressing long-term entrenched challenges. Madam Deputy President, let me put that much more plainly. It's very easy for the government to do three things that give the impression of progress while in no way holding themselves accountable to making an actual difference in solving the biggest challenges faced by our state. See if these three things sound familiar. Firstly, the government says it's investing record amounts in a particular area of policy. Sounds impressive, but it's completely meaningless in terms of actual achievement of outcomes. $1 more than last year is a record investment. It's a meaningless statement. It is the outcomes of that investment, the outcomes that investment they are committing to achieve, that becomes the meaningful measure of the government's success, not the claim to record investment of and by itself. A commitment to accountable outcomes is what the government must be putting on the record, not crowing about record investments. The second thing that might sound familiar, another familiar tactic, is when the government says it's adding X number of new positions to an area of public policy. Might be teachers, might be police or the like. Sounds impressive, sounds like a very good thing, but in itself it is completely meaningless in terms of accountability to achieve actual improvement in outcomes. It's progress on achieving meaningful outcomes and improvements that the government must be held to account for in the area into which those new positions are being added. The third common sleight of hand to give the impression of progress that's often used by government is when it says it will establish a new special role or an entity to take lead responsibility for this policy area or identified issue. Those announcements sound impressive. It's a new commission, it's a very special new role with an impressive title. But in and of themselves, they are completely meaningless in terms of accountability to actual improvement of outcomes. What progress on achieving meaningful outcomes and improvements will the government be held to account for in establishing that shiny new, often impressively titled role or entity? Madam Deputy President, we could almost play bingo with this government using these three hollow tactics to appear that they use to appear effective. In each of those all too familiar refrains from government, what we get is a description of activity without an accompanying commitment to achieving an outcome. Activity is so appealing, is it not? It looks and sounds impressive. It's easier to have a big list of activities to tick off and crow about than to be held to account for progress on the outcomes of those issue areas. This very familiar pattern, continuing unchecked, is why we can have a government merrily making announcements of, for example, planning to build impressive sounding numbers of social houses year after year, while across that self-same period of time we see our social housing waitlist blow out to historic levels. Ticking off a list of activity is easy. Being accountable for making change, for making progress on outcomes that we seek and prioritise as a community is all too often completely avoided by this government. Which is why I believe that the opening of a new parliament, reflecting a newly re-elected government, is a timely place and opportunity to again reiterate the need for a comprehensive, whole-of-government, meaningful set of progress performance indicators which are set with community input and are independently auditable. I've been investigating, in fact, Madam Deputy President, models in place elsewhere for policy delivery, monitoring, evaluation and accountability reporting frameworks. And I can report that in this regard, Tasmania is in fact falling well behind other jurisdictions nationally and internationally. We were doing so even before the 2020 pandemic and definitely since. A common element of different interstate and international models is a shift to budgetary and reporting mechanisms focusing on policy outcomes rather than just financial inputs and outputs. As the model in Victoria states, I quote, "Good public policy and service delivery must demonstrate its value to the community. In the past, government has measured what it does and not necessarily what it achieves. Often government focuses on outputs, what activities, products or services it is providing and how much it costs to provide them. Just monitoring and reporting on outputs doesn't provide evidence of the impact of our work. Focusing on outcomes instead of outputs allows us to better identify what we want to achieve for Victoria. It connects our work with communities, experts and service delivery sectors. It also provides flexibility and enables us to communicate what we want to achieve in a way that is meaningful for Victorians." What an interesting and refreshing approach from the Victorian Government. And indeed, in 2019, the Western Australian Government released its set of 12 key priorities in the Our Priorities Sharing Prosperity program. It claims to set ambitions and accountable targets that will, and I quote, "will require a sustained focus and in some cases the development of new and innovative approaches." Currently, the WA Government acknowledges that this program has been temporarily suspended in light of COVID as a priority focus, but ideally a meaningful policy progress framework would incorporate the necessary flexibility to be able to revise and adapt with the purposes of that revision and learning important lessons. Oh, sorry, I've lost my place there. Oh, I'm going to move on. Queensland. Let's talk about Queensland. They also have a Financial Accountability Act 2009 which requires that the government prepares and tables in its Legislative Assembly a statement of the government's broad objectives for the community. These priorities are also made publicly available on the government website, along with an individual letter from the Premier to each minister outlining each minister's portfolio priorities in accordance with those published government key priorities. They're referred to as the Premier's ministerial charter letters. It's expected then that the government provides regular status updates against those objectives that have been put forward as their accountable priorities. In New South Wales, I was most interested to look at the model that they have there because it's quite a comprehensive one. In 2015, there were 12 initial Premier's priorities launched by the New South Wales Government. They were then subsequently updated to the current 14 announced in 2019. These 14 policy areas are designed to deliver on key transformational goals, and those goals are defined as this in New South Wales: a strong economy, highest quality education, well-connected communities with quality local environments, putting the customer at the centre of everything we do, breaking the cycle of disadvantage. But it's not just empty words making a list like that. The model there in New South Wales for each of the 14 policy priority areas actually lays out measurable baseline, interim, actual and target indicators that are reported on publicly and made available online. In New South Wales, there's a Premier's Implementation Unit, the PIU, that monitors and reports on progress with the input of the agencies responsible for delivering the specified targets. The Premier receives monthly progress updates, and every 6 months, delivery reports are provided to the Premier and Cabinet. This priority focus, this approach, is now also reflected in the New South Wales state budget process and papers, with the 2018-2019 budget papers outlining a shift. You love this, Madam Deputy President. Budget papers outlining a shift to outcome budgeting rather than the more reductionist output and particular line item spends focus. Significantly, the New South Wales Progress Policy Performance Model is independently auditable. In 2018, the New South Wales Auditor-General conducted a progress and measurement of Premier's Priorities performance audit on the initial 12 priorities, which made improvement recommendations. And also importantly, social change advocates, such as NCOS, have seen an improvement in policy delivery and accountability. And indeed, in speaking with them directly on this, I heard that groups like NCOS utilise those articulated priority areas to do the advocacy that they do on the social issues that are their priorities. It gives them a common language to talk with government, particularly when it comes to targets, when it comes to data collection and when it comes to making measurable progress. Madam Deputy President, while no system is completely perfect, and these New South Wales key goals and the 14 policy priority areas may not be the ones that would be relevant for us here in Tasmania, the point is that in other jurisdictions, substantial progress is being made and significant acknowledgement is given to the fact that you can't just make a list that you tick off of activity. You actually have to commit to delivering accountable outcomes. Those models from other areas, from other jurisdictions, demonstrate that it's possible to put in place models that can be evaluated and reported against, enabling a more transparent accountability mechanism which the broader community, not just government, not just us here in Parliament, but the broader community and all stakeholders and policymakers can engage with. It's also worthwhile to quickly mention New Zealand in this benchmarking of real progress indicators that I'm outlining here. Since 2019, New Zealand has released 3 annual wellbeing budgets. They are structured around collaboratively produced Living Standards Framework, the LSF indicators. And the intent of these indicators is to underpin the goals from budget to budget to measure whether financial allocations translates into real improvements for people's daily lives. Let me just pause there and reiterate that. This is the government that is actually holding itself accountable to not just announce what they're spending and crow about it, but to measure and report on what real improvement in people's lives those investments are making. This shift to a wellbeing framework was announced by the New Zealand Government in 2018. Significantly, when announced, it was introduced as a framework and management tool, which would, and I quote here, it would assist the government in coordinating a cohesive government work program across portfolios. The approach seeks a more comprehensive and accurate representation of the issues New Zealanders are experiencing and that the government is responding to. It aims to provide a broader and more relevant measure of success. And further, it says this: at the centre of the government's approach is a desire to change the manner in which the government sets priorities, monitors progress and reports results. The approach seeks a more comprehensive and accurate representation of the issues New Zealanders are experiencing and that the government is responding to. The government's aim is to provide greater transparency across priority areas, what actions have been undertaken to achieve its goals and how they have resulted in change. This approach provides a more relevant and broader measure of success. Well, fancy that. We know this because part of the government's commitment, we know all this about New Zealand because part of that government's commitment to transparency is that it releases publicly cabinet papers, actually within 30 days of cabinet meetings, which outline all manner of things that have been dealt with in cabinet, including this wellbeing approach and the recommendation that was made to cabinet to adopt it. Transparency step in this manner would be wonderful to see with this Tasmanian government. I'm not going to hold my breath on it, but we can all live in hope. Following the 2019 release of the first wellbeing budget in New Zealand, the World Economic Forum, held in Davos, described that budget as groundbreaking and said that New Zealand wants to transform its politics to focus on kindness, empathy and wellbeing. Who here, Madam Deputy President, would not agree that Tasmanians deserve a similar focus from its government and Parliament? But such efforts need to extend beyond lip service and just dropping words like compassion into speeches. Words are empty without clear and accountable actions and measurable outcomes to back them up. There's a global push for a more purposeful capitalism, implementing new metrics. For example, The Guardian reported in 2019 that Lord Richard Layard, a program director at the London School of Economics and the vice chair of the UK all-party parliamentary group on wellbeing economics, also publicly called for wellbeing to replace growth as the main aim of UK spending. Madam Deputy President, as we know, this concept of community-developed shared progress indicators and publicly reported updates on social measures is not entirely alien to Tasmanians. The community has previously embraced the notion of a transparent system of performance indicators in the format of the former Tasmania Together process, which intended to measure real progress of agreed priorities for the period of 2000 to 2020. Unfortunately, despite the dedicated and hard work invested into that process, we saw it truncated early before its completion. And while it was picked up and integrated across operations of some sectors, for example local councils, we didn't see it become entrenched within or shape even the state budget process in a transformational outcome-focused manner that we're now seeing in New South Wales with their model and in New Zealand with theirs. However, one critical component of the Tas Together project, which I think is a strength, is that the key priority areas that sat at the heart of that initiative were identified and driven by a comprehensive community consultation process. In contrast, many of the examples that I ran through from other jurisdictions reflected more of a political prioritisation process imposed from the top down by governments of the day to a large extent, rather than developed in a collaborative manner from the community up. I believe that should Tasmania move to catch up with these more modern, responsive and accountable outcome-oriented policy progress frameworks implemented elsewhere, we can actually become global leaders through incorporating that invaluable Tas Together experience by ensuring any identified key priority areas are developed in collaboration with the Tasmanian community. Wherever possible, we should avoid being limited to the top political priorities simply of the government of the day. Madam Deputy President, to reiterate, I believe that Tasmanians deserve to have this government invest in their immediate and long-term wellbeing within a transparent and accountable outcomes framework. Such a framework would deliver public confidence in a genuine commitment to achieving real progress on our entrenched challenges. In support of that, I further believe it's incumbent upon all of us elected representatives and legislators to assist with that transition to governance that gauges and measures real long-term impact of government policies rather than short-term outputs. I invite other members here to give consideration to how we, in our valuable role, can more effectively establish an expectation on government to set, measure and report on progress towards important policy outcomes. I know most of us have areas of particular interest and attention in which we could readily contemplate outcomes measurements that would be meaningful when it comes to government accountability. I look forward to exploring this further. I think there's much we can do to assist with this task. And on that note, Madam Deputy President, I will conclude my remarks and note the address.
The honourable member for and Minister for several things.